Hello and welcome to ITWeb TV Live at Security Summit 2025 in association with Smart Technologies. I'm joined now by Bevan Lane, who's the CEO for Infosec Advisory Group. Bevan, welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. So one of the topics that you covered, and I didn't give the big shout out to Security Summit, but 2025 marks the 20th anniversary for Security Summit. So I believe you were tasked with looking back over the past 20 years and maybe even a little bit further for our cybersecurity history in South Africa. Can you give us some of the kind of highlights? And I know there's one in particular that I want you to kind of mention, was around the elections in 94. But yeah, what have been the highlights? What have been the key things that you found that perhaps we've forgotten about in the past 20 years?
Yeah, what I tried to do is only look sort of in the first 10 years of ITWeb and not the new stuff that's happened in the last year. So just look at a history lesson. And I ended up going back, as you could do, at 94. I looked in the 90s and there's very few security incidents that happened in the 90s. And that's why it's so interesting to find that the couple that had happened. And while I was doing a search for ones that I knew about, the most famous is the 99 EDCON logic bomb, which is my whole talk was based on that. I found out about a book, a guy called The Birth of the Country. Peter Harris wrote a book about the elections and South Africa's birth. And in that book, he spoke about an incident that happened where during the elections, somebody got into the Excel spreadsheet and started trying to change the figures in the spreadsheets and the database and try to take votes from the ANC and replace them with right-wing Conservative Party votes. Mm-hmm. And we don't know who it was. We don't know anything beyond too much. But the one of the guys didn't talk about it for years. But the reason that the elections were delayed for a few days was because of the fact that they had to go back to the manual papers. And they literally ignored the whole spreadsheet and all the data they had and did it. And as I mentioned in my talk, nobody really knew the numbers at the time because it's the first time you're allowing the entire country to vote. So you've got like a set number of white voters. Now you've suddenly got a huge amount extra. And that's what I think is what the hacker was doing. So he got into the network, got into the forms, and he was taking votes from the ANC, removing them, putting them into another form for Conservative Party or whoever it was at that time. And it was obviously some sort of idea to change all the votes and actually destabilize everything. Because imagine now, the ANC would only got 30% and these guys would have got 30% and would have caused absolute chaos in the country. Yeah. But we never knew who did it, so we couldn't track it down, and they fixed it by doing a manual thing.
Okay. And you mentioned the 99 EDCON logic bomb. Can you give me a bit more detail about that one?
So that one here, the first time I heard about that was halfway through the case where a guy called Ian Melamed, who was a bit of a legend in those days, was talking about representing the guy. And he says he was interviewing somebody who was completely broken down by the company. They forced him to take a 50% reduction in his salary, and they threatened him with being fired. And he had been passed over promotion many, many times. And he got to a point where he thought he'd do something extreme. And I don't think there's ever been a similar case in South Africa ever where somebody internally wrote software to bring down, and he brought down every single store. And he actually damaged the hard drives of a lot of these stores by doing what he had done. He deleted all the information, stopped the stores from operating. And I worked it out on today's terms. It cost about 90 million rand in damage that he did back in those days. So they tracked him down quite easily, arrested him. And the case, I spoke to a couple of people who were in the police in that time, and it was before any of the cyber laws, so they didn't know what to do. And they looked at all the different options and what to charge him with. And one was damage to property, and the other one was trespassing, and the other one was something similar to that. And they realized, well, there was no physical barriers. They couldn't get him on trespassing, but they could get him on damage to property. But the police sat there for weeks trying to work out what to actually charge you with because of the electronic laws, but a large reason why the ECT Act and the cyber law came now is because of that incident.
Okay. And then obviously you tracked those back over time. Have there been things that you saw back then, and you say we learned the lesson from the EDCON case? have there been things that you saw back from the past 20 years that we still haven't learned the lessons of, that things that are still happening today that, maybe we should have smartened up a bit about these things?
Yeah, I mean, I closed the presentation on sort of the 5 or 6 things that I thought, are still. I think the main thing for me was that things haven't changed because the core root crime is still the same. And we tend to, when we look at AI, we look at cloud, we tend to forget about the fact that actually it's still the same thing. It's just done in a different mechanism. And any good security person, any good investigator, good policeman should be able to go, well, that's still fraud, that's still damage, that's still, theft. And I think if we understood those roots, wouldn't get sidetracked by the fact that it's been done by AI now. A lot of the same stuff, not doing background checks on people, not keeping an eye on administrators, not having logs. Most of the cases I was involved in during those time period, we would have no logs. The guy would go in and delete all the logs. We'd have nothing to really investigate. We'd have to do investigation through physical means because we didn't actually have any logs. And I still see a lot of those same things happening now. People still not really understanding that, the root thing is preserve the logs, understand that the evidence is critical, and also, the controls around people are still not really being followed very well.
Okay. So we've learned what hasn't changed, but what has changed? How have the conversations evolved from 20 years ago to today? I mean, obviously AI is probably the topic conversation at the moment, but yeah, how have things changed?
I think a lot of the stuff has changed due to the skills definitely have improved, the knowledge of the cybersecurity industry to be able to do this. I mean, back in the day when I was doing this, there were 20 forensic people in the country that could do any investigations. You'd always find one of the 20 people. Now you've got a much wider scope of things, but you also have, through using things like Azure and AWS, you have things in the cloud that are saved for you. So you've got a lot of evidence you can get to. You've got to pay for it, but you can get to it. So it gives us a lot more ability to do these investigations. I do also think that we're able to actually understand the problem far better than maybe what we did there, because Logic Bomb was a thing nobody even thought could exist. So you couldn't design a control to stop a Logic Bomb if you had never thought of the eventuality.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then those lessons over the 20 years, what advice would you give to CISOs, having kind of done your research? What are the controls that you would say should be informed by the history and not just kind of compliance?
The biggest one, we did a big security incident last year, and it was, again, somebody internally working with somebody outside. And when you look at those sort of ones that I'm talking about right in the beginning, when you look at the election act and the EdCon act as well, internal people were both involved. We don't know whether there's an election officer trying to do the hack, for example. So, you need to understand that still to today, that's the one that should worry you the most. And you should be putting controls that can sort of deal with that, because if you're blocking your perimeter and somebody's really inside, opening a door for somebody. The one we did last year was exactly that. Somebody was inside and he was able to do information. And when I finally realized who it was, he had done so much damage by then, working with the external attacker. So for me, that's still very much something CISOs should be looking at a lot better.
Do you think, how do we solve that insider threat issue when I've heard talk around like behavioral analytics, kind of keeping track on people's movements inside systems? Well, what would be your kind of advice?
It's a very good question. It's that line between Big Brother and letting people do their job. But I do think trusting people to do their job is important, but we should have certain sort of thresholds where we're going, all right, somebody's doing something they shouldn't be doing. And setting up alerts for certain behavior and understanding that what could go wrong internally is almost setting up like a threat vector thing. What could an internal person do, and how do we actually counter that? Understanding that risk is critical, and I don't think a lot of people really do it well. They talk about mistakes, they talk about internal malicious acts, but they just sort of put AV in place, and they think that's going to deal with it.
Yeah, okay. And if we sit down in 20 years from now, what do you think, when you look back on the 20 years ahead of us now, what do you think are going to be the big kind of issues that South Africa's cybersecurity community will face?
I think it's the level of attacks in terms of nation stacks and targeted attacks, as an example, are increasing so much now. And I think one of your questions you were asked, which I don't know if you're still going to ask, was about, what is the biggest attacks internationally in the last 20 years I've thought about. And I thought Stuxnet and the Ramco one for me are the two that stick out because they were so targeted and the impact they had just spread across so many industries. What happened with CrowdStrike last year, good examples of things which have so much wider impact. And as we've gone into the cloud, as we're bringing in AI, there's all those worry points. So for me, not just going to have Encon affected now, you're going to have every single retailer affected. And look at Marks and Spencer's. Look, it's a perfect example of what's happened now. Marks and Spencer's, Co-op, what's the other one? Harrods. You've got three together, and every single retailer in South Africa is going, could that happen to us? And trying to do that. So for me, it's so much wider. When I worked in the Northeast, I was there because of the Ramco breach. All the other oil and gas companies in Qatar and Bahrain all suddenly had to do so much more now because they saw the targeted attacks. And I do see that's where it's going much more. Yeah.
Okay. I've done a few of these interviews. Most of them give me grey hairs than I've already got at the moment. What gives you hope about cybersecurity in South Africa for our next 20 years? What's good about where we are or where we come from and where we're going?
The one slide was about diversity. It's huge. I'm in the UK and I'm trying to hire staff, and it's just you go into a classroom and you see 50 boys together in a classroom doing IT, and you say to them, diversity is a thing, and they're like, yeah, it isn't really. Here you see it. It's there already. So we've got so many different ways of thinking. So much improved in terms of not being constrained by it. A lot of young people, I'm literally only hire young people in my company because I'm trying to give people an opportunity to come in. And I just see the excitement, the keenness, the way that they think being different. So yeah, for me, that is exciting. I do think the industry has changed quite a bit in the last 10, 20 years in terms of all those sort of things. So yeah, it definitely gives me an excitement.
So that's interesting because, one of the topics that has come up again every year, I imagine, for the past 20 years is skills. And a couple of the people I've spoken to, we talked around, it's okay, we don't have a skill shortage, we just have an experience shortage. And it seems not unusual, but the fact that you're hiring young people, how are you kind of dealing with that lack of experience, or kind of how are you hiring the right people?
It's a great question because I've got it wrong many times. I think you learn from getting it wrong, but I look for a spark. I look for somebody, I get my guys now to do the first interview of the people coming in, and they're looking for someone who's got the same interests as them. So when we're interviewing somebody, that they must be, if they want to be a pen tester, they must have done so much on Hack the Box. They must go read. They must really be passionate about what they're doing. They know they can't get into cybersecurity through the traditional mechanisms because they don't have all the certifications and all the experience, but they've got that interest. And all the guys working for me now have got that interest. And when they interview people, we just hired 2 new staff members on May the 1st. And we did all that. We were like, what is your interest? And we don't want somebody that wants a job. We want someone that wants to work in cyber. And that for me is the way that you do this. So all the guys, no experience, they're all studying university degrees now or about to, and they're all going to get the education, the experience working with us. It's the only way for me to do this, yeah.
And what do you find about staff turnover? Obviously you're training them up.
Yeah.
And I know there's certain types of organizations in the publishing industry, so that's my kind of background.
Yeah.
They would kind of pay, I'm not saying you are paying lower, but they would come get in junior graduates, give them a year, 2 years training, and then but they're gone. We've got to go through the whole process again. How are you getting that right? Not kind of losing staff?
I every time you think you're getting it right, then someone leaves. But in the same context, what we are doing is we're giving them a long-term vision. And you can see, we're the grey guys, been doing this for a while. I'm not going to be doing this for the next 10 years. I'll be somewhere in the next 5. So I'm building something as I can, and then bringing people that can share that vision, knowing that there is a long-term plan for them to, I was talking to Patrick from Mobius, and that's been his model. And I love that idea. You build businesses and you give it over to people to run with you being there to guide them and mentor. And I think once you get over 50, you should be seeing yourself as a mentor, and I hope the team all do think that they see that that's my dream to do that.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I guess you're in forensics, right? So how has that kind of evolved over the 20 years? How has that changed? I'm sure probably 20 years ago, it wasn't really a massive thing. Like you said, there was maybe 20 people then.
Yeah.
And I think I was speaking to Danny Myberg, and he was saying it's about 200, was it?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you've obviously seen that evolution from your side.
So I pulled out of doing forensics directly because I realized I couldn't keep up. And I think that's the like, you get to a point where you're either full in or you're not. So I've got staff members doing it, and we work with partners now to do it. But I think that's probably the biggest difference. I saw that, it's just pretty easy. You've got a Windows 95 operating system and a Windows NT server, and you need to know what you need to do with that. And then you get mobility, then you get the changes, then you get all these different operating systems, and you get the cloud. So things were changing so quickly that I stopped doing it. But I think that's the biggest change I've seen. The complexity is so much bigger. Yeah. We used to go and download a whole server, make 4 copies, go and then do keyword searches. It was really not that difficult, but the keywords you had to think about, you had to understand what you're doing. Now it's still keyword searches, so it hasn't changed that much, but it's a lot more complex about where you're going, what you're trying to understand.
Okay. Yeah, Bevan, that's been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing 20 years of what's happened around this local cybersecurity space.
Thank you so much. It's been great fun, yeah.
That's been Bevan Lane. He is the CEO of Infosec Advisory Group. Please stay tuned. We'll be back shortly with another interview.